I speak to you today with feelings of profound sorrow. She combined these qualities with warmth, humor, and an unerring ability always to see the best in people.
When King Charles quietly signed the letters patent in the privacy of his study, almost nobody understood what had really happened. Because this wasn't about Princess Anne. It was about something far bigger. And by the end of that day, one member of the royal family had been moved closer to the throne than anyone expected, while another found themselves further from the center of power than ever before. At first, it looked like just another royal announcement. A title, a ceremony, a photograph for the history books. Then the reports began to appear. The Daily Mail called it a historic shift. The Times spoke of a quiet revolution. Palace observers noticed the way the king's private secretary lingered just a second too long when handing over the documents. Then something even stranger happened. On its own, none of this looked important. A princess attending events, a brother and sister sharing a moment. But together, it became impossible to ignore. Because suddenly, this wasn't about ceremony anymore. This was about continuity. And the question that hung in the air, unspoken but impossible to escape, was simple. Why Anne? The announcement came on a Tuesday. A press release. A few carefully chosen words. His Majesty has been pleased to appoint Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal as Regent. The language was formal. The tone, deliberate. But the subtext was what caught the attention of those who knew how to read between the lines. Then the photographs emerged. There was, and at the state opening of Parliament, her presence undeniable. There she was again at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, her expression unreadable. And then, the image that said everything. The king and his sister walking side by side through Buckingham Palace's private gardens, their conversation hidden from the cameras. Palace insiders noted the frequency. The public noticed the symbolism. But very few asked why. Because a regent isn't just a title. It's a role reserved for those trusted to rule in the monarch's absence. To sign documents. To represent the crown. To hold the nation's future in their hands. And in modern times, that trust had only ever been bestowed upon those in the direct line of succession, and was not in the line of succession, which meant this wasn't just an honor. It was a statement. When the king could not be there, she would be. But why not William, the Prince of Wales, the future king, the man who had spent his entire life preparing for the role he would one day inherit? If anyone was the obvious choice, it was him. Then the reports began to emerge. Page 6 whispered of tensions. The Sun hinted at a delicate balancing act. And then, the photograph that said more than any headline. Prince William, standing alone at a public engagement, his usual confidence replaced by something quieter, more contemplative. What nobody expected was the reason. It wasn't about William at all. It was about Catherine. The Princess of Wales had not been seen in public for weeks. The official line, recovering from surgery. The unofficial whispers, something more complex. A source close to the royal household told the Telegraph that the king's decision had been influenced by the need for stability. His Majesty is thinking about the long game, the source said. And right now, the long game doesn't involve adding more pressure to the Prince and Princess of Wales. Which changes everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't about tradition. It was about practicality. If Catherine's situation required William to be by her side, someone else would need to step in. But if not William, then who? Camilla seemed the obvious answer. The queen consort. The woman who had spent decades by Charles's side, who knew the monarchy's inner workings as well as anyone. But she was not the one standing beside the king when the letters patent were signed. She was not the one whose name appeared on the documents. And she was not the one who, in the days that followed, began to take on more of the duties that had once been William's. Which meant this wasn't about Camilla either. It was about Anne. And here's where things changed. Because Anne wasn't just the king's sister. She was the only one of his siblings who had spent her entire life in service to the crown. No scandals. No controversies. No public fallouts. Just decades of quiet, steadfast duty. The Princess Royal had earned a reputation as the hardest working member of the royal family. A woman who showed up, did the work, and asked for no recognition in return. In the weeks leading up to the announcement, Anne had been given a series of high-profile engagements. A state visit, a military ceremony, a speech at the United Nations. Each one, a test. Each one, a message. And each one, she had passed with the same understated competence that had defined her public life. Looking back, it all made sense. The king hadn't chosen Anne on a whim. He had chosen her because she was the only one who could do the job without the job changing her. The only one who understood that the role wasn't about power. It was about responsibility. But if Anne was the answer, then what was the question? And more importantly, who was being left out? Meghan, the Duchess of Sussex. The woman once hailed as the modern face of the monarchy. The woman who, in a few short years, had gone from royal bride to royal outcast. The woman whose name was now conspicuously absent from the list of those considered for the regent's role. Then the commentary began. Meghan ignored, screamed one headline. The final snub, declared another. Social media erupted. Some saw it as justice. Others as proof of a monarchy unwilling or unable to change. and a few saw it as something else entirely. The inevitable end of a story that had begun the moment Meghan and Harry stepped back from their roles as senior royals. But here's where things get interesting. Because this wasn't about Meghan. Not really. It was about what Meghan represented, a future that might have been, a path not taken. The king's decision to appoint and as regent wasn't a rejection of his daughter-in-law. It was an affirmation of the values that had always defined the monarchy: duty, stability, continuity. And in a world where Meghan and Harry had chosen a different path, one of financial independence, of media deals, of a life outside the constraints of royal tradition, there was no place for her in this chapter of the story. Which changes everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't about personal feelings. It was about institutional needs. And in that context, Anne wasn't just the right choice. She was the only choice. But if this was about the future, then what about the past? It turns out, the real story didn't begin with the announcement at all. It began years earlier. In the quiet moments. The private conversations. The decisions made behind closed doors that would only come to light when the time was right. There was the moment, in the early days of Charles's reign, when he had reportedly confided in aides that he wanted to streamline the monarchy, to focus on a core group of working royals, to ensure that the institution could adapt to the demands of the modern age. There was the moment, a few years later, when Anne had been given a more prominent role in the king's official engagements. A signal, a test. And there was the moment, just months before the regent announcement, when Charles had allegedly sought the advice of constitutional experts, not about whether he could appoint a regent, but about who he could appoint. Looking back, the signs were all there. The way Anne had been included in more state occasions. The way her name had begun to appear alongside her brothers in official communications. The way the king had, on more than one occasion, referred to her as his most trusted confidant. But nobody had connected the dots. Until now. Then something unexpected happened. A few days after the announcement, a photograph surfaced of Anne at a military event, her uniform immaculate, her demeanor steady. The caption read, "The Princess Royal carries out her first engagement as regent." The image was unremarkable. The moment, anything but. Historians noted that the last time a regent had been appointed was in 1936, when King Edward VIII abdicated, and his brother George VI briefly served in the role before ascending the throne. The parallels were striking: a monarchy in transition, a nation watching, a decision that would shape the crown's future. But there was one key difference. George VI had been the heir, and was not, which meant this wasn't just about filling a role. It was about redefining it. And here's where things took another turn. Because while the public was focused on Anne, the king was reportedly already thinking about the next generation. Prince George, Princess Charlotte, Prince Louis. The monarchy's future was secure, but the present required a steady hand. Someone who could bridge the gap between the old world and the new. Someone who understood that the crown's survival depended not on dramatic gestures, but on quiet, unwavering service. And was that someone? But the question remained, what did this mean for the others? At first, the focus was on William. If Anne was being given more responsibility, did that mean his role was being diminished? Was this a sign that the king was sidelining his heir in favor of his sister? Then the palace insiders spoke. This isn't about William, one source told The Guardian. It's about ensuring that when the time comes, he can focus on being king, not on the day-to-day responsibilities that come with it. Another source, speaking to BBC News, was more blunt. The king trusts Anne implicitly, but he also trusts William, and he knows his son will have enough on his plate without worrying about acting as regent. Which changes everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't about favoritism. It was about foresight. About a king thinking not just about his own reign, but about the reigns that would follow. But if this was about the future, then what about Harry? The silence was deafening. No statement. No public reaction. No social media post. Just nothing. Then the speculation began. Was Harry hurt? Angry? Indifferent? Had he even been told before the announcement? The tabloids declared, Harry snubbed again. The final betrayal. But the truth was more complicated. Because this wasn't about Harry. Not really. It was about the choices he had made. The life he had chosen. The path that had taken him and Meghan away from the royal fold and into a world of Hollywood, podcasts, and a life on their own terms. In that world, there was no room for the responsibilities Anne had embraced. Which meant when the king made his decision, Harry's name had likely never been in serious contention. But that didn't make the omission any less significant. For the first time, it was official. Harry was no longer just stepping back. He was being left behind. And the question lingered. Did he even care? At first, the public reaction was muted. A few headlines. A flurry of social media posts. A collective shrug from a nation grown accustomed to royal drama. Then the polls came in. A majority of Britons supported the king's decision, not because they had anything against Meghan or Harry, but because they saw Anne as the safe, reliable choice. The choice that made sense. But beneath the surface, there was something more. A quiet acknowledgement that the monarchy was changing, that the old rules no longer applied, that in a world where tradition and modernity were constantly at odds, the crown would have to navigate both. And Anne, with her quiet competence and unwavering sense of duty, was the perfect symbol of that balance. Which meant this wasn't just about one title. It was about the future of the monarchy itself. But here's where things get even more interesting. Because while the public was focused on Anne, the palace was already looking ahead. The regent title was just the beginning. There were whispers of more changes, a slimmed-down monarchy, a focus on core family members, a recognition that the institution could no longer afford to be all things to all people. And at the center of it all was Anne, the Princess Royal, now more than ever the king's most trusted ally. The woman who had spent a lifetime in the shadows, only to step into the light when her brother needed her most. But the real surprise wasn't Anne's rise. It was what it revealed about the king. Charles had always been seen as a traditionalist, a man rooted in the past, a monarch who believed in the old ways. And yet, here he was, making a decision that was anything but traditional. By appointing Anne, he wasn't just breaking with convention. He was redefining it. He was saying the monarchy's future wouldn't be determined by bloodline alone, but by something far more important, trust. But then something even stranger happened. While the world was focused on Anne, William, Harry, and Meghan, there was one person largely overlooked, Camilla, the queen consort, the woman who had been Charles's rock for decades. And yet, when the time came to appoint a regent, her name had not been the one on the king's lips, which raised a question nobody had dared to ask. What did Camilla think of all this? At first, the answer seemed obvious. Of course, she supported the decision. Of course, she understood. But then the palace observers noticed the small details. The way Camilla's smile had been tighter in recent photographs, the way she had been seen in quiet conversation with him, the way she had begun to take on more of the king's duties when he was unavailable. And suddenly, the narrative shifted. What if this wasn't about Camilla being sidelined? What if it was about her being freed? Freed from the expectations of the regent's role. Freed to focus on the aspects of royal life she truly loved. The charities, the patronage, the quiet work behind the scenes. Which meant Anne's appointment wasn't just a statement about the Princess Royal. It was a statement about the queen consort, too. The message was clear. The monarchy was big enough for all of them. But here's where the story takes its most unexpected turn. Because while the world was focused on the regent's title and its implications, there was one detail that had gone almost entirely unnoticed: the timing. The announcement had come at a moment when the king's health had been the subject of quiet speculation. Nothing official, nothing confirmed, just whispers, rumors, the kind of palace chatter that always swirled around the monarch, but this time carried more weight. And suddenly, the decision to appoint Anne as regent didn't just make sense. It made urgent sense. What if the king's decision hadn't been about the future at all? What if it had been about the present? What if, in that quiet moment in his study, Charles had been thinking not about the years to come, but about the days, the weeks, the possibility that there might come a time, sooner rather than later, when he would need someone he could trust to step into his shoes. In that context, Anne wasn't just the right choice. She was the only choice. At first, the realization was subtle. A throwaway line in a Daily Beast article. A cryptic remark from a royal biographer. Then the pieces fell into place. The king's recent cancellations, the cane he had been seen using, the reports of preventative health measures. And most telling of all, the way Anne had, in the weeks leading up to the announcement, been given a crash course in the king's constitutional duties. Which changes everything. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about a title. It was about a contingency plan. A quiet preparation for a scenario nobody wanted to think about, but everyone knew was possible. The king was mortal, and if the worst were to happen, the monarchy would need to be ready. And, with her quiet competence and unshakable sense of duty, was the one who would ensure that it was. But if this was about the king's health, what did it mean for the nation? It turns out, the answer was hiding in plain sight. In the days that followed the announcement, as the world digested the news, a strange thing happened. The nation didn't panic. There were no cries of alarm, no demands for transparency, no hand-wringing over the king's health. Instead, there was quiet acceptance. A recognition that, whatever was happening behind palace walls, the monarchy was in safe hands. And that, perhaps, was the most revealing detail of all, because it proved the king's decision had worked. Anne's appointment hadn't just been about preparing for the future. It had been about reassuring the present, about sending a message that, no matter what happened, the crown would endure. But here's where the story takes its final, most poignant turn. While the world was focused on the big picture, the titles, the roles, the constitutional implications, there was one detail overlooked: the personal. At first, it was just a feeling among those who knew the royals best, that there was something deeper at play. Then the stories emerged. The way Anne had been the first person Charles turned to in the darkest days of his marriage to Diana. The way she had stood by his side during the turbulent years following their mother's death. The way she had, time and again, offered quiet support without expectation or fanfare. And suddenly, the king's decision didn't just make sense. It made emotional sense. Because Anne wasn't just the most qualified person for the job. She was the person Charles trusted most in the world. And in a life defined by duty, protocol, and the endless demands of the crown, that trust was the most precious thing of all. Which meant this wasn't just about power. It was about love. But then, just when it seemed the story was complete, one final question remained. Meghan, the woman whose name had been so conspicuously absent. The woman who, in another life, might have been the one to step into this role. The woman who had forced the monarchy to confront its own limitations. And the question was, did she see this coming? At first, the answer seemed obvious. Of course she did. Meghan understood the game, the politics, the unspoken rules. But then the reports surfaced. The way she had been unusually quiet on social media in the days leading up to the announcement, the way she had been deep in conversation with Harry about the future, the way she had spoken in a recent interview about focusing on what truly matters. And suddenly, the narrative shifted. What if Meghan hadn't been ignored? What if she had simply been out of the picture? Not by design, not by malice, but by the simple logic of a life that had taken her in a different direction. A life that came with one inescapable truth. Some doors, once closed, could not be reopened. Which meant Anne's appointment wasn't a snub to Meghan. It was a recognition of reality. And so, as the dust settled, as the headlines faded and the world moved on, one thing became clear. This had never been about Anne, or William, or Camilla, or Harry, or even Meghan. It had been about the monarchy itself, about its ability to adapt, to evolve, to find a way forward in a changing world. In that context, Anne's appointment as regent wasn't just a historic moment. It was a necessary one, a quiet revolution, a statement of intent, a promise that, no matter what the future held, the crown would endure. At the beginning, this had looked like one simple royal decision. A title, a ceremony, a photograph for the history books. Now, you know why it wasn't. Because sometimes, the most important changes inside the monarchy aren't the ones that make the headlines. They're the ones that happen so quietly, so seamlessly, that nobody notices them at all. Until years later,